Welcome to Coffee with the Principals. I'm one of your hosts, Jake Booker, principal at Lake Grove Elementary, and this is my co-host and partner in learning, Brooke Perry.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So this is a podcast designed to explore one aspect of our school system, and the idea is that it can be researched, written, recorded, and produced in the amount of time it takes us to finish our coffee. Today, I'm having a Guatemalan medium roast. Brooke, what do you have?
That sounds fancy. I have a 100% Arabica French roast pod.
I was going to say, mine is the opposite of fancy. Mine is literally from a Keurig. Keurig, for people who don't mind bad coffee.
Mediocre coffee.
Yeah.
Mine is Walmart brand. So
Oh, that's nice. Mine is QFC brand. Box 96. So you'll probably see me drinking more Guatemalan medium roasts on the podcast. All right. So this episode is part of our remote learning series, and it's really focused on how to build and maintain teacher-student relationships from a distance, right? Like in remote learning. The book that we're learning from and we're leaning into is the Distance Learning Playbook by Fisher, Frey, and Hattie. But we'll probably go on a couple of bird walks based on our own experiences. So let's jump into it.
And I have to say, Jake, this book, it's trending on Twitter, it's trending on Instagram. It is really popular right now, and I can tell why. There's a lot of good stuff in it. So I'm excited to be talking about it with you.
Yeah, and as a fairly old person, I'm just going to put it out here. It's on Facebook too.
It's on Facebook too.
It's on the Book of Faces. I've seen people talking about it, people from our district and people from other districts that somehow haven't removed me from their friends list. So yeah, it's all over the place.
Love that. The great thing about it too is this book was literally written in the last couple months in response to the spring of remote learning that our entire nation saw, right, from March on. So it is up to date, it's relevant, it's really good stuff.
Yeah. So we're gonna kind of launch into this episode. And I think we should probably kind of prime our thinking, right, around what does empathy, unconditional positive regard, genuineness, disenfranchisement, what do those things kind of look like, and how do they appear in remote learning?
Absolutely. These are things that, we talk about all the time, and they come maybe not naturally, but it's something we've been working on. These topics, these are things we've been working on in our brick and mortar classrooms, right? So this is not new information, but it's really about taking these topics and thinking about what they look like you said, in remote learning.
Yeah, kind of bridging, right?
Mm-hmm.
So taking what we know from our brick and mortar and bridging that to what we're learning about remote learning.
Exactly.
So let's kind of jump into it here. Let's talk a little bit about teacher empathy. So when I think about it, it's really about being thoughtful and considering how your students, your scholars, can make those connections with you, right? As a veteran teacher in a brick and mortar classroom, I know how I can create empathy. I can do it with just a glance, right? It just takes a moment. I make some sort of meaningful eye contact that says, I see you, I hear you, and I appreciate you. And that isn't necessarily possible in the same way with a web camera, right? Like next time you're in a Zoom meeting, try to lean in really close to the camera and see how people react when your eyeball is like literally up in the camera.
That's not over well.
No, it's
empathy building.
Awkward, super awkward. I mean, I've done it. And I know people are like, wow, that's weird. So, you know, a lot of our go-to methods and kind of creating those human-to-human connections are going to be different, right? They're not impossible. They're just different. And there are ways to let our kids know that they're being seen, that they're being heard in a remote session, right? If it's asynchronous, send an encouraging note with some feedback that helps them kind of delve and dive deeper into their thinking. Probe them with a question that helps them build like that task to self connection, right? If you're doing your Zoom, your office hours, and you're Zooming with families, let your scholar show you a pet, a favorite toy, right? Speak to their families, hear what they have to say about their lived experiences, and then share your story with them. It's okay to share your story.
Exactly. And when we think about empathy too, there's not a more important time, right, than right now when we consider what everybody's facing, what our world is facing. There's not a more important time to really leverage showing empathy to our scholars and beyond that to their entire families. Like you said, when we're having open office hours, if we're talking with parents, this is also a really vulnerable time for families, opening their homes basically to us in a way that's never really happened. And actually that reminds me, we were talking about it the other day, Jake, when we were doing the meet and greet with Principal Booker, with families. We had about 12, 13 families on board. And we were talking about it after that virtual Zoom meet and greet, and the wonderful family liaison, our family liaison, Patty Samora, mentioned, how can we leverage home visits that we, sometimes do in person, leverage that virtually with Zoom.
Yeah, and what would that look like, right? Like, like I've done lots of home visits, and it's, as a teacher, it was me and a counselor or the principal, or, there'd be a group of us who would just kind of go and, we might stand at the door, we might go inside, depending on, the comfort level of the family. But how could we bridge like that known to this new environment and remote learning? And Patty had this amazing idea. Why don't we do some Zoom sessions where we schedule times with the family?
And it doesn't necessarily have to be, in the past, home visits can sometimes be, or most often are, in relation to something concerning, right? Maybe an attendance issue or something along those lines. Let's flip the script a little bit and do them as an incentive or do them as an engagement opportunity.
I love that idea. I love the idea of being able to say, hey, um, here's a system we have in place. Here's something that we can do. So yeah, I think we're going to be looking for teachers who are like ready to jump on board and do some of these visits. And I remember one of the things that I took away from like my in-person visits, like it would take me an hour to do a home visit, right? Like I have to drive there, and then we're maybe there for 40 minutes to an hour, and then we're done. We can get in and out of a virtual home visit in 20 minutes.
Exactly.
And it doesn't take that long. So I think there's an opportunity here to really do something different and special.
I agree. Shout out to Patty. That was a great idea.
Let's talk about unconditional positive regard. This is a cool idea. This is the idea that you need to be really intentional about how you let scholars know you care about them. And it really isn't possible to demonstrate unconditional positive regard until you've really been thoughtful and purposeful in your efforts around developing empathy, right?
Right. This reminds me, when I was reading this the other day, I hopped onto my Instagram and I asked my group of my peers, it's a lot of teacher friends, a lot of friends that I grew up with, people around my age. And I asked them, thinking back into the teachers you had, think about the one you learned the most from. And I was really careful with my words there. The one you learned the most from. And I asked them to share with me one or two characteristics or qualities of those teachers that they remember most. And I had a lot of responses. I had like 30 plus responses. And one of the main themes was that those teachers took time to get to know them. They took time to get to know who they were, what they liked, how they learned best. And another major theme was that those teachers met them where they were. right? And that takes time though. And that's something that we usually build over the course of the school year, right? In person with our students. So how are we going to do that in a remote learning environment?
Yeah, I think that kind of gets us to like, how do we actually do this, right? Like, what are some of the things that we can do to kind of build some of that uh, unconditional positive regard, right? So if you think about how in that remote learning environment, um, you know, how will you be able to understand your scholars well enough to weave their lived and learned experiences into your teaching, right? How are you going to be able to do this with a classroom full of kids that you may have never met in person? It can be done. Like, I know it can be done. I've seen it in other remote learning environments. But one of the things, like, in our internet academies and stuff, but one of the things that it takes is just to be very intentional, right? Very intentional teacher moves. One way you can do this is by creating like a tiny exit poll, right? Ask ask your scholars about their experiences using your Canvas assignments. It could be as simple as incorporating an extra question about themselves into an exit ticket, right? But I think the key is, um, and it's really where that rubber is going to meet the road. How do you use that kernel of what you learned about them as an individual to build those upcoming lessons, right? How are you going to take what you've learned from them and put that into a lesson, right? Because when a student can see themselves represented in your lesson or what you're teaching, they'll know who put that there, right? And it
Yep.
is an easy way of showing a student that you care about them as a person, right? You took that time.
The what that does for engagement and what that does for kids developing that sense that they belong, that's huge. And it just takes a little bit of extra time.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be something we will definitely need to lean into, because one of the big challenges that we're going to be facing in remote learning, right, is number one, attendance,
Right.
right? And then number two, engagement. Because if we could get them in their seats, right, in front of the camera, and we can get them hooked in, now we need to figure out a way to get them thinking and engaging and doing work at higher levels of rigor. But we can't do that if we can't get them here, right? And we get them here by creating that connection, and helping them understand that, you know what, you are important and you're respected and you're part of our learning community, and we want you here.
Yeah, we need you here. We
We
see you. We need you here.
And it has to be, and they have to feel that, and they have to feel it authentically, right? So that kind of leads us into our next our next idea, um, and it's about just being genuine, right?
Right.
And you know, what can we say about being genuine? Then first and foremost, be confident in who you are as a teacher. If you have 17 years of classroom experience or 6 months student teaching, you absolutely are the one who will make a difference for each and every one of those kids in your class. Embrace your authentic self, and realize that you might not have years of experience delivering high quality instruction over Zoom or through Canvas, but
Newsflash, none of us do.
us do, right? But you have the capacity to bring a level of optimism to your room that says, we're going to spend our time together growing and learning and reading and making a mess and cleaning it up, all in the name of learning.
Right?
This is our
And right? One of the things that I know really can help build that empathy, build that connection with between students and teacher too, is like you said, being genuine, be authentic, that you're learning now too. We didn't learn how to be stellar remote virtual teachers in our pre-service experiences or in our student teaching experiences. This is new for us. So be open about that with your scholars, how you're learning. You're going to make mistakes, and then you're going to learn from your mistakes and move on. What a great real life example of that. Something that we try to instill in our kids every day.
Yeah. And And keeping in mind, right, that you really, the onus is on you, right, of making congruent your words and your actions that you're demonstrating in your Zooms, in your Canvas course, in your breakout rooms, that these are all places of learning. This is seriously where your commitment to scholars will show. And they will absolutely, they'll react to that either consciously or subconsciously, the very tiniest of details, right? Like um, your Zoom background. Do you have a background going, or are you sitting in a closet somewhere, like in a bedroom with clothes hanging all over you, or are you out in your backyard? Are you talking, so they'll pay attention to your Zoom background. Grooming. Did you like literally just get out of bed this morning? Are you like seriously teaching from your PJs? Or are you showing and demonstrating that, like, you know what, you're in it. We're going to do this together. You're professional students. I'm a professional teacher, and this is what we're going to do today, right? And keep in mind that words that either elevate or demean, um, they happen, right? And it's sometimes hard to remember that there are literally no throwaway comments, right? I can't tell you how many times I've said something and then just wish moments later that I could like absolutely rewind that. I'm sure I've said stuff today that I'm already like, oh, if I had a rewind button.
Yeah, I'm keeping track. No, I'm kidding.
It's like a big tally board. Days since Jake
That's
has
my background.
just have to pull that one off. It's back to zero.
Well, that's so important though, Jake, that you bring that up, because unlike our traditional brick and mortar classrooms, right? Our instruction is in our scholars' living rooms or their family rooms or their dining rooms. And inevitably, there's going to be family members, parents, grandma, grandpa, siblings that are hearing all these interactions, right? So it's just that, I mean, we're all professionals, and I know that to be the case, but it's just that heightened level of awareness of what we're saying, of how we're saying it, of how we present ourselves. And like you said, are we in PJs, or did we get dressed today? Did we comb our hair today? And it's not just about our outward presence, it's about how it makes us feel, right? Like I feel more capable and confident when I'm a little bit put together.
Yeah, I know. I would just to echo that idea. My daughter is going into sixth grade, and I
Mhm.
would be in the room when her fifth grade teacher was trying to teach through Teams, and I was hearing things and trying to like not wear the administrator hat or the teacher hat, but wear like the dad hat,
Right.
and give grace and understanding, and just be like, okay, this is new for everybody. But then also to like watch her and watch how she reacted to things, and just it's very obvious when somebody is like really genuinely and authentically engaged in their conversation with you, and when someone is kind of zoned out and
Mhm.
really fully in the moment with you as a student. So that's something that I took away from last year, just kind of going, yeah, that's a thing, right? um, and it leads to something else. uh, it leads to disenfranchisement. And this is something that happens in brick and mortar classrooms too. And for me, it really begs the question, how do we react to students who are maybe a little bit more reserved or reluctant to speak up in a Zoom session, right? What does a student who's been disruptive feel when their microphone is muted? And how do the students who see their muted microphone feel? Like, what is the impact on that whole classroom? Um, and I'll tell you, most kids are exceptional at picking up what we're putting down. And while they might not be keeping a scorecard, they're absolutely able to identify patterns and trends. Um, and I'll just share kind of on a personal level, as a student who honestly felt unwelcome uh, in most of my classrooms. Um, I can remember what it felt like to be ignored, by a teacher. And like I can't like give a play-by-play accounting of every criticism or rejection or chilly interaction I had. I could be honest, that 40 years later, I could tell you with a really high degree of certainty which teachers made me feel unwanted and which ones could accept me and my quirks. And in the remote environment, I think those stakes are even higher, right? When a disenfranchised kid is in your building, hey, they're physically there, right? The reality is that they're sitting in a seat in front of you, right? Their physical location is with you. But in the remote environment, if a scholar is feeling disenfranchised, they're going to turn off their camera, or they're going to mute themselves, or they're just going to log out, or they just won't log in the next day.
Right.
I don't know.
It's so much easier to disengage. And I think this is something we just need to keep on the forefront of our mind, and also remind ourselves that a lot of times this isn't something we purposely do, right? This isn't something we are like cognizant about. But even when we think about, I know the text talks a lot about our scholars who we just don't feel as successful with as teachers, whether it's helping support a behavior challenge, or whether it's helping them develop language in order to interact with the learning, right? As with our ELL scholars, if we don't feel as successful with them as teachers, it's actually pretty natural for us to disengage, because that doesn't feel good, right? So it's something that we need to just be aware of now more than ever. How are we making sure we're engaging with all of our scholars, even the ones that we maybe typically would shy away from a little bit because we're not sure what to do next?
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk a little bit about how to give attention and some ways of interacting. So I didn't want us to end on that last topic, right? Because it's pretty heavy. It didn't feel right? Just like leaving that hanging there. So let's talk about how we can connect with some of those kids and give attention in our remote classes. So we talked earlier about bridging, right?
Yes.
And this is a great opportunity, right? So a lot of the same strategies that you would use in your brick and mortar class can be used in a Zoom session. First thing you want to do though is think about a system, right? Think through your system. What works for you? What works with your style? I personally tried putting names on craft sticks, and it didn't work for me. It didn't feel right. But I had a teacher partner who just loved those sticks, and she was all over those sticks. She kept them in like her pocket, and she would just whip them. It was amazing. Well, I found that worked better for me was actually having my attendance sheet, like a copy of and I would just tally mark. And at the end of the day, I could literally look at my tally marks and be like, oh yeah, I completely ignored so-and-so. So tomorrow I'm gonna revisit that, and I'm gonna think through what are some ways that I can engage with that person, and why was I not engaging with that person?
That was gonna be my next question. Yeah.
Right. And then that leads me to be a little bit more reflective and a little more introspective. What is it about them? And sometimes, maybe it was, they were doing some behaviors that kind of hit close to home that reminded me of maybe some of my behaviors. And I was like, oh, I just can't. Right. But I think through it and I move forward. And the next day I engage more with that student. And it's also a really great way to like kind of keep track of, how are you, what are your equity practices? Right? What are you doing in your classroom? And if you look at that and you're like, oh, I only call on boys, or I only call on girls, or I'm only calling on the students who are, English language learners. Like, how am I structuring that?
See patterns. When you track it, you see patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
that's really important. That's really important. I think that's a really common practice that I see in a lot of teachers' classrooms in our brick and mortar. So this is our opportunity to take something that we're familiar with, we're comfortable with, and it's a really easy transition to virtual. I know that there are a lot of cool apps too. Like I have a popsicle stick app I wasn't the actual in-person stick person either, but I have an app that I used to use. I had a little name spinning thing online that my kids loved to see who would get called on next because it was kind of like a little game. One thing that you have here that I think is really important is just remembering to give scholars a heads up, right? So that they can process and think ahead of time. We don't want to disenfranchise kids by embarrassing them or putting them on the spot and they're not, prepared to speak. A lot of times kids need processing time. So saying, Jake, we're going to come to you for question number 6, be ready to share kind of thing. So that's something just to keep those practices at the forefront of what we're doing, just like we would in the classroom.
Exactly. So let me go back. I think we got one more to go. Oh, this is it. Brooke, how's your coffee looking? Are you close?
I'm almost done with it.
Mm-hmm. I have a little bit left. Mine's almost done. And I think we hit, most of the key points
right
from this section.
Right.
So I think next time, why don't we do another one, and we'll come back to this book and we'll do some more discussion around distance learning playbook.
I like that. And I think the big takeaway today that I just want people to remember is that, this is an environment that's new. None of us are experts. We're learning as we go. But the great thing about it is a lot of what we do know and are comfortable with, just with some tweaks, we can apply to remote learning, right?
Yep, absolutely. All right, with that, thank you.
Thank you. Good chat.
Yeah, bye.